Welcome to my channel. I'm Gary Weriawan, and in today's video, I want to share my review, my thoughts, and my experience of this tiny little camera, the Panasonic Lumix GX850. Intro. So, as some of you guys might already know, I'm a big fan of Micro Four Thirds camera system. However, I'm also a big advocate of using what you already own to prevent what we call gear acquisition syndrome. However, recently I just bought this Panasonic Lumix GX850 brand new for a really good price. So this is a beginner Micro Four Thirds camera from Panasonic Lumix, and the thinking was I want to try to use this camera as a secondary body, especially when I'm traveling, so I can have two lenses ready at all time. Usually one is a wider angle lens and one is a more telephoto lens. With this camera, I can supplement my GX85 really well, and that sounds like a good justification for the purchase. However, I must be really honest with you, this is just another case of gear acquisition syndrome. I'm so ashamed of myself right now. So now, after 2 months of using this beautiful tiny little camera, I just want to share my thoughts, my experience of using the Panasonic Lumix GX850, what this camera is good for. I hope that you guys will stick around in this video because actually this tiny little camera is full of pleasant surprises. The specification might not say much, but I think this is a great camera and a great choice as well, whether you are a beginner photographer, an enthusiast photographer, or maybe even a professional photographer. Now let's start with the basic specification of the GX850. Now, I'm not going to give you a detailed full specification of the GX850 because honestly you can just go online and Google it, but I just want to mention some key specification regarding of this camera. First, let's talk about the sensor of the GX850. It features the same 16 megapixel no anti-aliasing filter sensor that is on my GX85 and also on my G85. Identical sensor, and that means dynamic range is really good, not the best, but is very acceptable, just like on the other cameras. High ISO performance, very mediocre, just like on the GX85 and the G85 again. But without the AA filter, everything is really sharp and detailed. Again, just like the GX85 and the G85. In fact, the GX850 is so similar to the GX85 that the GX850 almost looks like the GX85's little brother. It's smaller and lighter. It's only 269 grams, so it's very lightweight, perfect for travel photography when weight is always an issue, especially when you're traveling with plane. I found myself using the GX850 a lot recently because of the lighter weight and the small form factor for my everyday photography as well. When I'm going out and about, just having a dinner with my wife, when I'm doing nothing serious, just trying to find pictures in everyday mundane life, I will always use the GX850 now, and I document the whole process of my everyday photography into POV style vlogs where I explain the camera settings, my thought process, and how I come up with the composition. You can check out those vlogs up here on the card above. As I mentioned before, the GX850 is very similar to the GX85, but there are few key differences between these two cameras. First, the screen. I want to say that on the GX85 you can have that articulating screen. On the GX850 you have the flipping screen instead. So maybe this is not as useful if you are doing street photography or that kind of stuff, but now you can take self-portrait using this camera. A silly feature, but I think it is still useful. And then also there's no viewfinder with this camera. You can only compose using the rear screen, and that's your only way to monitor what you're looking at with this camera. And then also the storage solution is not using regular full-size SD card, but now you have to use micro SD. Not a big problem for me, but maybe a problem for some people. And then also there's no front manual dial to change the aperture or some other exposure setting like on the GX85. So all of the manual control, you can only use the rear button right here. It's a little bit limiting, but not a big problem for me. Other differences, the GX850 doesn't have hot shoe, so you cannot really use external flash. However, it still features a built-in flash should you need one. And then other differences, there's no manual video mode, so this could really hinder some serious filmmaker to use this camera. However, you can still record video up to 4K 30 frames per second or 25 frames per second depending on your region, and it will use automatic mode or maybe one of the priority modes. Yeah, those are all the minor differences between the GX850 and the GX85. However, there is one big difference that I haven't mentioned, and that is the lack of in-body stabilizer IBIS on the GX850. And that means if you are using unstabilized lens, then you cannot really do slow shutter photography handheld. You have to use tripod, and you also cannot record smooth stable video footage handheld. You also have to use tripod or any other stabilization device, support device to help to create smooth, stable video footage. There are two important notes that I want to share to you. First is regarding the lack of manual video control with the GX85. Yes, that's a little bit problematic for me personally. However, I only need this camera to record B-roll. I don't really use this camera to record A-roll or any serious video project, so I don't really need to have that cinematic 180-degree shutter setting, that kind of stuff. I just wanted to record simple B-rolls, and it's been doing a really good job. For my A-roll camera and for my series video camera, I'm relying more on the DJI Osmo Pocket 3, the camera that's currently recording this video. If you want to hear more about the DJI Osmo Pocket 3 from my own perspective, you can check out this card above. I have a mini review of the DJI Osmo Pocket 3. Second note is regarding the lack of in-body stabilizer on the GX850. Yes, it's a big problem for me. I've been really dependent on that technology to help me to take pictures in lower light condition with slow shutter speed without having to use tripod or all that kind of stuff. But actually, I think the lack of IBIS in this camera is a blessing in disguise. It helps me to cure that addiction to in-body stabilizer, and now slowly I start to be able to take slow shutter speed photography without tripod again using this camera. You might want to check out this video up here where I try to use longer telephoto portrait lenses to take portraits of my wife with this camera without using IBIS. Some other points regarding specification of the GX850. The autofocus speed is very similar to the GX85. That means in single autofocus it's very fast and reliable, but continuous autofocus really suffers. Battery life is so-so. I don't think this guy will survive a full day of shooting, so you might need a spare battery. And then there's also no audio jack for attaching external microphone. I think that's a missed opportunity from Panasonic Lumix because this camera already features a nice flipping screen, and with the help of audio jack, it could make this camera into a great vlogging camera. There's no grip whatsoever with the GX850, and it really makes the handling of this camera really bad. But again, the camera is really small and lightweight, and you can always add an external grip if you need to improve the handling of this camera. And then also there's an option to use electronic shutter, which I really use almost all of the time, and that really helps to prolong the shutter life of this camera and also to reach really high shutter speeds. So now, after using these cameras for more than 2 months, I want to share my experience to you, my thoughts about the GX850, and while I'm doing that, I will share some sample pictures taken using this camera. First, I want to say that specification doesn't always translate to real-world usage. As I mentioned before, the specification list of this camera is really underwhelming because this camera is marketed as a beginner camera. But I really need to say that this camera is full of pleasant surprise. I was not really expecting this camera to perform really well, and I found some functions and features that I thought, gimmicky and useless, but ended up being really useful and really changed the way I think about photography in general. First, the flipping screen. I thought it's going to be another useless feature of a beginner camera because I'm not really taking a lot of self-portraits. I'm not really a narcissistic guy. But after using this camera for a few months, I started to realize, oh, this is actually a useful feature. Not to take a self-portrait of myself, but actually to take a self-portrait of me together with my wife in one frame. We actually don't have that much photo together in one frame because whenever we ask strangers on the street or another family member to help capture our photo together with a camera, they always miss the composition or something is always wrong. And I don't really have time to set up a tripod to take a picture of us together. But now with this camera, I started to take a lot more selfie together with my wife, and we can have high quality picture taken using this camera of us together in one frame. This might sound silly, but photography isn't just about getting beautiful pictures. It's also about preserving moments, and I'd like to capture more moments with my wife together, and this camera really helped to do that. Next, I want to talk about the lack of manual control, which I think is also another blessing in disguise. Yes, lack of manual control means that if you are shooting in full manual, then it will be really painful for you to change exposure settings using only one dial on the rear of the camera. But now I started to trust my camera more, so I'm shooting in aperture priority or shutter priority instead of full manual mode. And by trusting my camera more, I can start to take pictures quickly, and the camera doesn't really get in the way anymore between me and the picture that I want to take. And that's really nice because usually I have to think about, oh, the exposure settings. I need to set the shutter speed, I need to set the aperture and whatnot. And that really takes time, and that makes me really slow, and that really gets in the way between me and the picture. Now by trusting my camera more, the camera just sort of disappears and turns into an extension of your body. Still speaking about manual control, thankfully there are two buttons that you can program for a custom function. This button right here, FN3, and also this button right here, FN1. I set the FN3 button for changing ISO and the FN1 button for exposure lock, which is very useful for when you are using aperture priority or shutter priority. You want to lock the exposure when you thought the exposure is already correct so that the camera doesn't really change exposure when you are recomposing or doing that sort of thing. Anyway, I personally think that the smaller size and the lighter weight of the GX850 is really the key factor of the overall user experience of this camera. The GX85, this guy right here, is already small and lightweight. I don't really have any problem with this camera, but look at the GX85. It's even smaller, it's even lighter. It feels almost like nothing in your hand, especially if you are using smaller lenses. So I feel less burden every time I need to bring this camera out and about with me, or for travel or for things like that. This translates into me bringing the camera out more often, and bringing the camera more often means taking more pictures, and taking more pictures means more practice time. So I feel that this camera really helped me to improve my skill as a photographer by letting me have more practice time because of the smaller size and weight. And that translates into better image quality, better kind of pictures overall. I shared some tips about how to improve as a photographer. The key is not having the best camera, the most megapixel, the sharpest lens. No. It's not about that. It's about Practice, it's about trying to become better as a photographer. You might want to check out this video up here. I share my tips on how to become a better photographer and improve your picture immediately. There's also a certain fun factor thing going on with this camera that I cannot really explain. Maybe it's because of the overall user experience, or maybe because of its beautiful tiny little form factor, or because of some other thing I cannot really explain. But this camera is really addicting, makes you want to go out and take pictures. And when you start taking pictures with this camera, you don't want to stop. You want to keep taking pictures. It's just so enjoyable, so fun, and so addicting at the same time. The specs cannot really tell you about how addicting this camera is, but once you start handle this camera, pick it up and start taking pictures with it, you know what I mean. This is such a fun camera to use, and I really enjoy all the time that I spend taking pictures with this GX850. Now let's quickly talk about image quality. And as from the sample pictures that I shared to you that you've already seen, you can probably tell that the image quality again is very similar to the image quality of the GX85. All of the pictures look really nice. There are plenty of dynamic range. Everything looks contrasty. Everything looks sharp and detailed thanks to the 16 megapixel no AA filter sensor of this camera. Keep in mind that I personally only use RAW format on all of my cameras with the GX850 included. I never really shoot JPEGs, and when I'm shooting RAW, I post-process my images using Adobe Lightroom. Now let's talk about my favorite setup with the GX850, my favorite lenses to use with this camera. And to no surprise, I will always favor smaller, lighter lenses, especially for a smaller camera like the GX850. And that means, as some of you guys might already know, the usual suspects. Panasonic Lumix 14mm f2.5, Panasonic Lumix 20mm f1.7, the kit lens 12 to 32mm f3.5 to f5.6, or maybe the Olympus 45mm f1.8, or the Laowa 7.5mm f2, or even the Panasonic Lumix 35 to 100mm f4 to f5.6, my favorite telephoto lens. However, surprisingly, and I really mean surprisingly, my most used lens on the GX850 is the Olympus 75mm f1.8. I'm kind of surprised as well because the Olympus 75mm is not a small lens, especially for micro four thirds standard. It's also not light at all, but on the GX850, it doesn't feel weird at all. It doesn't feel unbalanced. So I found myself using this lens a lot more than I anticipated, especially for taking portraits of my wife and also a little bit of landscape photography and just like candid random portraits of strangers on paddy field or things like that. I will share some sample pictures. So in conclusion, I really enjoy using the Panasonic Lumix GX850. This camera might be marketed as a beginner camera. However, when I started using this camera, I really think that this is a capable camera even for an enthusiast like me. Well, the question now is, will this camera replace my GX85? Absolutely not. But this is a really good alternative to the GX85 if you don't mind its shortcomings. Next question, will I use this camera for professional, serious photography kind of environment? Maybe not, but I have no doubt that it can still perform really well on those kind of situations. For the same price range of the GX850, I'm sure there are lots of other cameras that might offer better features, better technologies, better image quality compared to the GX850, no doubt. However, I still think that the GX850 has its own mojo and character. It's a very fun camera to use. It's very enjoyable to use and it's very addicting as well. I cannot really stop taking pictures with this camera. And for me, that kind of aspects of fun, enjoyable to use thing is also very important. It's not just about image quality. Photography, again, as I mentioned in my other videos, isn't just about the end result. It's also about enjoying every steps that you have to take whenever you are taking pictures. And the GX850 helped me to be able to enjoy photography even more. It's a really fun camera to use, and I'm really thankful for all the time that I spend with this camera. I really enjoy all of those time, and that for me is all that matters besides the image that I take with this camera. And that wraps up today's video. So that is all for today's video. I hope that this video has been able to help you decide whether the GX850 is the correct camera for you or not. So please share down below, what is your favorite small camera to use every day? Also, if you have any question about today's video, comment down below as well, and I will try my best to answer them. Also, don't forget to support my work by liking this video, sharing this video, subscribing to my channel down below. And if you want to support my channel even more, please consider using the affiliate links on the description, or use the super thanks button to make a small donation to my channel. It will be greatly appreciated. Thank you, and see you on the next video. Goodbye.